This at the University of Nebraska from the Biological Systems Engineering Department. I used to be the director of the Nebraska Tractor Testing Laboratory, as well as teaching professor. I'll tell you how I came to Lincoln. The first time I came to Lincoln, I came actually it was December 1974. It was a lousy, miserable winter, and Lincoln looked like one heap of slush and cold with horrible bare trees. And it really didn't look like much, but I had some friends here from my time at Purdue University, where I did my doctorate between 1965 and 1969. And so I had some contact here, and the person who brought me here by the name of Bill Splinter, who was the head of the department, seemed to be the right type of guy and very convincing, and made me an offer, and I accepted, and that's how I came here. Before that, I actually came directly from Israel, which will which will cause a little story later on in my narrative. So I went back to Israel, where I'd been an advisor to the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, and I was teaching part-time at their Israel Institute of Technology. And so on April 1st, no, actually before that, in March, somewhere in the middle of March, I arrived in Lincoln, and that is the story which I'll tell you right now. The people who were supposed to pick me up was the former director by the name of Lester Larson, and an assistant by the name of John Carlisle. They were supposed to pick me up, and they had been told that here's this guy coming from Israel, and he's going to be the new boss. Well, they didn't know much about Israel, although that sort of surprised me. But anyway, the story is, and the true story, they had imagined that I would be dressed like the ultra-religious Jewish people in Israel, with a kaftan, one of those black coats, and those big hats, with a beard, and a white shirt, and really like somebody out of what used to be called shtetl, the little towns in Poland, because that's how these very religious Jews are dressed even today in Israel. So here they were waiting. And I think, I came from St. Louis, and so I came via TWA, and they were up there waiting, and they were looking for a guy who looked like that. Anyway, here comes a guy who looks like that. So they rush up to him and say, "Dr. Leviticus, welcome to Lincoln." And two older people who were standing by the side say, "That is not Dr. Leviticus, that is our son." And this guy came from New York City, lived in New York City in the religious Jewish community, and a half a minute later I came waltzing out, dressed normally, little guy, which I am, and they were sort of disappointed, they were these guys. And so, that was the story of my arrival here, sort of. What I was supposed to do immediately was to take over from the retiring Lester Larson in 1975, take over the whole management of the tractor testing lab and the whole program, and which is one of the really interesting programs the university has here, because this program is world famous. It's been known in all the agricultural circles for many, many years. Now, if you are in law or in biology or in the medical, then you've never heard of it. but anybody in agriculture anywhere in the world knows the Nebraska Tractor Testing Laboratory, knows the reports which they issue and how good they are and how impartial they are and how useful they are, because it helps those people to make a choice, selection between different models and select which of all those models or companies suits their purposes best. So for me it was a real change because I'd never done anything like that before. And I was hoping that Les Larson would help me a lot, but he told me very simply, he says, hey, this is something you've got to grow into, and everybody grows into this differently, and you just do what you want. And he just sat back and smiled and gave me a little bit instruction on the different instrumentation. But that was it. And I think by about May, I was without a tutor. So from 1st of April, when I started, not a joke, till May, that was it. That was my whole instruction period. So I had to be ready for whatever came. I've enjoyed these various contacts with the industry, the US industry as well as the European industry, because in the beginning, the Nebraska Tractor Testing Laboratory tested everything, every single tractor model which had to be sold in the state of Nebraska according to Nebraska state law. That changed in 1986, because in 1986 the US became part of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is a worldwide organization. And the code, the test code, which means the test methods and which are used to evaluate those tractors, and the sort of data which are published, changed at that time. But before that we were really unique in that we were first of all the only official testing facility in the United States. But before that there was nothing in Canada either. Canada came on board later on and has since closed again. Under the OECD program, other test facilities were set up in different countries of the membership, and today that membership is worldwide. I mean, China and all those countries are included, and each has their own testing facility and tests the tractors which are manufactured in that country. At the same time, however, a lot of developing countries like India, South Africa, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, India, Egypt, a lot of countries where there was manufacture of tractors wanted to set up their own test facilities and become members of OECD. And so I traveled an awful lot. I traveled so much that today I don't really want to travel anymore. I've had it. I've been all over. I've been in Australia, I've been in China several times, in India several times. And although I had fun every place I went, and I just really loved being with them, after a while it gets a little bit stale, and especially when you get older, to sit for many hours in an airplane is no fun anymore, even if you have a pretty girl sitting beside you. It doesn't work anymore because you're too old anyway. And but I had a lot of interesting adventures in the various countries, and most of them pleasant. I think that most of them were very fruitful, I can tell you of Ronald Roskins. He was in China one time. I was there before him. But he was in China when he was still the president of the University of Nebraska system. And he was in a hotel. And he came back to his hotel room, and there were 2 or 3 people sitting, waiting for him on a bench in front of his room. And they had a translator with them, or he had a translator with him, I don't remember. Anyway, he asked them what were they doing, what they wanted. And they said, well, do you know a Dr. Leviticus from the University of Nebraska? He says, well, I'm from the University of Nebraska, and I think I've met Dr. Leviticus once or twice. Would you please give him this and that and this and that message, because he's been so helpful and we want him to come back and so forth and all that. And he was just astounded that they knew the name of the University of Nebraska at all, and my name then in particular. And when he came back, he called me on the mat. He says, well, for a compliment in this case, not for a how do you call it, to give me some demerits or something like that. But anyway, that was one of the stories, and similar things have happened in Australia. Now, in Australia, when I was there, I was actually invited by one of their agricultural journals. And the agricultural journal, I think it was called The Land. They flew me all over because the distances are quite large there, just like here in the US. But the roads are, in some places, are pretty bad. Also, the year I was there was one of the years, it was in the late 80s or beginning 90s, when they had a lot of fires. So you couldn't move everywhere. So they flew us over some of those places where there were those fires to various small towns where they had set up a program where I was supposed to talk and do some demonstrations, which was always very interesting because not everywhere did they have the equipment which you needed to do a demonstration. So you had to improvise, and I love improvising. And I think I did a good job in most of the places. In India, I was invited at one time. One of the invitations was by the factories, but the other was by the, not by the industry, but by the Ministry of Industry and the Ministry of Agriculture. They had a dispute between them, and this was through the World Bank. And they had a dispute about how to test their agricultural equipment in a way that it would be more understandable to the user and not as academic as the OECD test was. They also wanted endurance tests. And so I was sort of an arbiter, which is pretty dangerous sometimes, because when you make a decision, you may make a decision and a recommendation which satisfied no one. Luckily, this time it worked out, and I still have some good contacts with them. Now here in Lincoln, the laboratory, which is on the East Campus, had in the meantime moved out of the old building, which is currently a museum, where I work as a curator, as a volunteer curator, after my retirement. We had moved into a new building, and we had new equipment, and we had to learn all that and see if it worked and if it was as dependable as the old equipment. Because when you issue reports on vehicles, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a car, or it doesn't even have to be vehicles. It can be a vacuum cleaner, a set of vacuum cleaners. It can be air conditioners, and especially with high cost items like tractors, when you issue reports, you have to make 100% sure that they are unbiased, that the various products are given the exact same conditions for testing, same test conditions. And that was sometimes pretty hard because in items like barometric pressure and humidity in the air and temperature affect a tractor just as much as it affects a human being. When it gets hotter, the air rises, the hot air rises, generally pressure goes down, the engine can overheat or gets hotter, and so you have to be extremely careful that you don't test one tractor at 60 degrees Fahrenheit and the other one at 95. So you have limits. And it was sometimes rather funny how we had to handle this, and you couldn't test in the rain out on the track because that would change the slip of the track, the slippage of the wheels. Because the way we tested things, we tested both inside the laboratory as well as outside the laboratory on a track. So there were a lot of variables which had to be taken into account, and that caused sometimes funny problems. There were also technical problems, of course, and sometimes they were real and sometimes they were imagined. And I've got to tell you about one case. Unfortunately, John is not alive anymore, John Carlyle, but John was always very picky and very precise and outstanding technician and a wonderful guy to work with. I'm really sorry that he isn't with us anymore, but John always went around and looked at the tires, and one day he saw that from one of the tires there was a little stream of moisture going down. Now, a lot of these tires are filled with a solution of calcium chloride so that they will not freeze in the winter. So he was afraid that that calcium chloride is extremely corrosive. And so valve stems sometimes corrode and start leaking. So he went over to the tire and touched it and then tasted it to see what it was. Well, it wasn't calcium chloride. It was something my dog had done. He had just lifted his leg beside the tire, and that was it. And everybody had seen that happen. And knowing John, we just waited until he came out to start the test car and for him to do his inspection. So we stood there all waiting impatiently to see what would happen. And by golly, we had a great time there. And, well, John looked sheepish, but he was such a great guy, it never bothered him that much. We had a lot of fun with the representatives of the companies. Every tractor which came there and every other machine we tested, we did also tests on other machines. Every machine which came there came with representatives of the companies. And we let the company representatives adjust each tractor so that it would give, and each vehicle, each machine, so that it would give its optimum performance. That way, if we would have had to do it ourselves, first of all, it's a lot of work. We would have to learn every machine, and we would have to be experienced with the use of every machine in order to really set each machine up to its optimum condition. And that's important, because if you have two machines and one is set up not for its optimum working conditions and the other one is, then the test is useless, because you have to have both machines in optimum condition. And that goes for other things like fuel as well. You have to have the same type of fuel, because different fuels, different batches of fuels even, have a different amount of energy content. And so, there's good gasoline, there's bad gasoline, but it's even more so with diesel fuel. So, we had always a lot of people from the different companies with us. And it was always a very nice, generally, a very nice situation, because we got along with them well. We knew that they had to get the best out of their tractors, and they knew that we would make it as difficult for them as possible so that they wouldn't screw around, and they wouldn't set up the machine in a way that it wasn't allowed to the farmer or the user of the machine to do. You can set up a machine differently, very well, but if it's not allowed and the machine is not warranted for that setting, then it's no good. Then the test is valueless. As far as my teaching is concerned, I did teach for 2 years for one of the professors who went to Morocco, where I joined him later as well, to set up a agricultural facility in a town called Setat. And I taught his courses undergraduate, but at the same time, for all the years that I was there, I taught 2 courses. One was vehicle dynamics, and the other was the theory of land locomotion, as it was called. That's the relationship between any type of contact element of a vehicle and the soil. And that includes your legs as well, of course, walking. And the theory of land locomotion is a very intricate theory, a very old theory, because even the Romans had some ideas of how to do that and all. And so I did teach these to graduate students. Mainly, I had a lot of graduate students who took that from foreign countries, because the knowledge of off-road locomotion wasn't that well developed in many countries. I had also military people taking that. In general, I liked giving that course, because there was a lot of give and take between me and the students. And I learned from the students. I learned to see the mistakes which somebody else made, because I gave sometimes things out of a book and I hadn't checked them well, and then they found a mistake in the book. And I found that also always very, very satisfying. I had worked in the area of off-road locomotion with the Israeli Army, and before that in New Jersey with the Mobility Research Group at Stevens Institute of Technology, and with a Mobility Research Group at the Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and with the U.S. Army Tank Automotive Command in Detroit, Michigan. So I did a lot of traveling even here in the country before I even went to Israel to work with the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and from there coming here. One of the nicest things I ever worked at, and the most interesting one, were evaluating different types of wheels for the lunar rover and the foot pads for the lunar exploration module. We had to work from data which were collected by the surveyor. I think it was the surveyor craft which they sent out to the moon, and which dug little trenches, and from that we were given data on the soil conditions, and we had to simulate that here on Earth. And we tested wheels, and it was a great time, a wonderful time, and especially when the first vehicle went up to the moon, we were sitting at Grumman Aerospace in their simulation, huge simulation room with good old Walter Cronkite giving the reports of the progress of what was happening. It was fantastic. And that's part of what I did here in Lincoln. Now, Lincoln has been very good to us here. I live in a nice house. I have a wonderful wife here, whom I met a long, long time ago in Israel also, and who is British. I've got many friends here, and I just love this state. I'll be going out in another 2 or 3 weeks with my sister on a trek which I've made a dozen times into the sand hills, which is, to me, one of the most beautiful parts of the United States. Nobody can tell me that the mountains are nicer. I like the sand hills. And, well, I think that is, unless there are some questions from the viewers and the interviewer, that's more or less what I have here. Well, I was born in the Netherlands in 1931, and I left the Netherlands in late 1949, and I was in a band at the time, in a high school band, and we had a hell of a good time playing all over the place. Went to southern France, and there we got into somewhat of a dispute. We disbanded the band, which is, and I stayed on in Marseille for a while. I lived there in the port area and worked in the port area. And then I hopped a ship where they needed somebody, and I liked adventure, so I hopped that ship and we went. It was one of those coastal traders, a very dirty old wreck, but it traveled, and it got me to see the African coast and some of the other ports around the Mediterranean. And then we ended up in Naples, where the ship, well, actually outside of Naples, where the ship broke down and we had to be towed into dock. So I was out of a job. They said they were not going to pay me while the ship was in dock. And it just so happened that there was a group of Dutch and British and American pioneers going to Israel on a ship, the Negva, it was called. And I just happened to meet them. They were filling up, they were embarking, and it took them about 2-3 days. And when I met that group, there was one blonde there, which I got on with very, very well immediately. And so I decided to go with them. And that's how I got to Israel in the first place. And so I was there and came there in, it was 1950, I think, in the beginning, or somewhere in the middle. I really don't remember the dates exactly. And we went to a kibbutz, one of those communal settlements. And I started working as a mechanic and what they used to call a falach, an agricultural tractor driver, and working in the fields, plowing at night and in daytime and doing all sorts of work. I enjoyed that rather, actually. And then we went to another kibbutz where we decided to live, to settle as a group. And that kibbutz was called Beth HaEmek. It's in the northwestern part of Israel, close to a city called, or a town really called Nahariya. And I stayed there for about, it must have been 2-3 years or something like that. In the meantime, I went into the army and had my training there, went into officer training as well, and then came back and worked some more. And then got sort of dissatisfied with the limited freedom I had. I was, I was sort of a free spirit, and I didn't like the restraints which communal life puts on you. And so I decided to leave. I left the kibbutz and I started working for one of the state companies which had tractors running in various places in Israel to help new settlements cultivate their soils, and I worked for them for a bit. And they sent me later on. They sent me together with some other people, and then I worked in several countries in Africa, where we introduced things such as Fordson major tractors and Caterpillar equipment, and did overhauls on Alice Chalmers equipment and all sorts of things I did. I did everything which was possible to make some money, and I did make money. And that was then in the early years of the 50s. In 1956, by that time I was working for an American professor who was sent out by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. His name was Walter Clay Loudermilk, a very well-respected and well-known scientist who was instrumental, or was, I think he even was the chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority at the time. A very well-respected fellow and a wonderful man. And he helped me, and I will say illegally, to get into the Israel Institute of Technology, because I wanted to study, but I didn't know really enough Hebrew to do the entrance exams. So he got me in there, and he promised me that I'd better do well, otherwise he'd break all my bones. And, well, I did well. In fact, I finished my undergraduate studies cum laude in 1960, and then did my master's there, and worked for the Department of Agriculture and for the university. Did a lot of experiments, which I won't go into because there were a lot of things. I had one or two inventions there which are still working, and one of them I happened to see a derivative of it anyway in Costa Rica in the banana plantations, which was a very nice thing, very fun thing to see that it still was working. And in 1965 I came to the United States, where I had been a couple of times before on short visits to attend meetings of the American Society of Agricultural Engineers, of which I was a member by that time, and the Society of Automotive Engineers, of which I was a member also at that time. I came to the United States to do my doctorate at Purdue University, which I finished in 1969. And then I worked at Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, which I mentioned before, earlier, that I worked there on the lunar rover, and we worked, I shouldn't say I, because there were other people involved, but we worked on instrumentation for the U.S. Army Tank Automotive Command in Warren, Michigan, and for the New Jersey transportation, what do you call it, the Department of Transportation, evaluations on traffic and so forth. I did a lot of things, and it was a lot of fun because it was all new for me and it was all wonderful. And then I had a request to go to Israel again to do teaching on what I had learned and experienced with military equipment, and also that was the teaching, and also to work with the Israel Defense Forces. Now, they let me go to Israel. I wasn't an American citizen at that time because I was still a Dutchman, a Dutch citizen. And if I worked with the military, it would not have been very nice if it would have become known at that time that I worked as an American for the Israeli Defense Forces. So I went as a Dutchman, and I was at the front and did all sorts of things. I was there during the '73 war and worked actually directly under Ariel Sharon. I knew very well. We were not personal friends because he wasn't that type of a person who had close friends among the more junior officers, which I was. I didn't get that far. And after the '73 war, I've told you, I think, yes, I did. In '74, I came here to the United States permanently to stay after this hiatus between 1971 and 1974. I came to the United States to stay. And I've stayed here in Lincoln and in Nebraska, and I hope that whoever sees this will let me stay. And that's my whole story, sort of. Well, what you see here is Tales from the Milestone, a book which I wrote about the years, which I haven't talked about the years before before 1949, actually the years during the war and before the war. This book I wrote here in Nebraska, and it's written, the name of the writer here is Ben Vayikra, which is a pseudonym which has a very specific meaning for me and for those who know Hebrew. It is explained in the book what this means. The book tells the story, my story, from the very early years after my birth in 1931 all the way through 1946, after World War II. I was a hidden child in the Netherlands and went through quite a lot of interesting adventures. And there was a lot of interest in me writing this book, a lot of urging from different people that I should write my story, because I had spoken and given lectures and presentations in many churches, schools, and social organizations like the Kiwanis and such. And they all asked me about the book, and then one day I decided that it's about time that I start doing something, and this is the result of that. It's just come out in January of 2004, and it is available in from www.iuniverse.com or other bookstores, or here in Lincoln from Lee Booksellers. And it tells my story. It tells the story of the people I lived with and I met, and the different unpleasant things which happened to me and my friends from school, and to my relatives.